It's the book club for kids.
It's a book club for kids.
It's the book club for kids.
It's the book club for kids podcast.
Hi, I'm Kitty Felde. This week we travel to South Korea, where mythology meets the 21st century.
Even though this is like a side story or romance, it kind of makes you think what is actually like behind the unexplainable.
That's one of our readers at the Richard Byrd Library in Springfield, Virginia. Our book is called Gilded, where our kick-ass heroine is pretty good with a bow in her hand.
I notch the arrow in, tight and snug, and take my aim.
Our celebrity reader is the wonderful actress Julia Cho, who you might know from the Lizzie Bennet Diaries. Our writer, Christina Farley, talks about what it takes to make a character come to life.
To really make a story feel true and to feel real, you need to put yourself in there.
This is the Book Club for Kids, the podcast where kids talk about books. We'll tell you how you can be on the show a little later on. But first, let's meet our readers. So why don't you guys just introduce yourselves and tell us a bit about our book this week, Gilded.
Hello, my name is Peter from Robert E. Lee High School in Springfield, Virginia.
Hello, my name is Corin, and I'm going to Lake Braddock Middle School in Springfield, Virginia.
Hello, my name is Mariana, and I'm from Lake Braddock High School in Springfield, Virginia.
It's really like a mythical book. It brings back memories of like Harry Potter and Percy Jackson, but it also has a side story of romance. And yeah, it's a pretty action-packed book.
The main character, Jae Hwa. Well, she's a girl who grew up in Los Angeles, and then she ended up moving to Korea with her father.
Well, she just wants to be normal, and she likes this boy named Mark, and later in the book you find out he's actually her protector. So I thought that was interesting.
At first, she was kind of confused on what's happening to her because these paranormal events are happening to her. Like, she sees a lion in an alley, and then she sees a mysterious man behind her, and then for all of a sudden, like, her body starts to tense up and she can't move or anything. It's almost as if time stopped.
She gets to dive into her past and her ancestors and into Korea's history that has revolved around her family for years.
While doing that, she uncovers a kind of a parallel universe and a supernatural side to her story.
That supernatural quality creeps into our story at a particularly public moment. Let's hear the scene where our heroine is about to demonstrate her archery skills at a public reception. Our celebrity reader is the marvelous actress Julia Cho.
I lift my bow and set it against my body. The drums boom beneath me. The shaman wails. I notch the arrow in, tight and snug, and take my aim. A gust of wind kicks up around me. I frown. They hadn't created wind yesterday. What are the producers thinking? Someone needs to turn off those fans. The drummers barrel away, oblivious of my concern. My hair whips around me. Now I wish I'd listened to the show coordinator and pulled it into a traditional top knot. Focus! I lift the bow slightly upward and bite the inside of my lip. The wind intensifies, and my skirts snap against my ankles. It's so strong now I can barely stand, but there's no way I'm going to make a fool of myself and not do this. I draw back, determined to give the special effects people a piece of my mind afterward. And release. The sun swirls in a rainbow before me as the arrow sinks into its center. Light scatters across the stage and spills toward the audience, but I don't move. Because inside the heart of the sun is a man. He's dressed in the traditional Korean style, with a black pointed beard and a top knot. His skin seems to blaze, or maybe that's because he's dressed in a silver hanbok. He stands there, staring at me with russet-colored eyes. He's got my arrow in his hand and a crooked smile on his lips. He bows slightly to me before disappearing into the golden blaze of the sun. Who was that man? He looked so real, so alive. Maybe he was. Maybe the special effects people assigned him to grab my arrow and didn't tell me about it. Behind me, I realize the audience is clapping. I squeeze my bow tight and swivel as the drummers and dancers bow below. The audience leaps to their feet, clapping vigorously in the glittery golden light. I take my bow. Mark is to my right in the second row, clapping. I wish that smile of his didn't make my heart sore. I spot Dad in the front row, a proud look in his eyes, and Grandfather next to him, but he isn't standing. His arms are crossed, and his frown is even deeper than earlier. What a grouch. The curtains close. My knees wobble as I take the steps back down. The drummers slap me high fives and shake my hand. One of the backstage guys I hung out with yesterday runs up to me. "That was awesome," he says.
Now, Peter, you compared this to Harry Potter. Explain what you mean. What's the similarity? What's the difference?
Actually, I would compare it more to like Percy Jackson, because it's like it's a main character who's fighting for her own destiny, fighting against mythological creatures, and she has like accomplices, and there's a lot of secrets that are to be revealed.
Let's talk a little bit about the style of this book, though. This idea, is it romance? Is it adventure? Is it supernatural?
Other than the supernatural part, it would be realistic fiction, but supernatural has a big role in this book, so it's probably science fiction.
I wouldn't classify this book to be a romance story because that's more of a side story in this book. I would classify it as fantasy book or a fiction book.
Let's talk about the mythology. Anybody familiar with Korean mythology before we got into this book? No, everybody's shaking their heads. Okay, so what sounds familiar? Because it always seems sometimes when we encounter myths in one culture, they show up in another culture. Were there any things that seemed kind of at least familiar?
They used a lot of animals from their culture. Like, I remember in Korea, China, and a lot of Asian cultures, they have dragons to represent like the most fiercest beast, alongside lions, and deers to represent lower class people.
One thing that sounded familiar to me was that, and this is in most all cultures, is that there are deities that control light and deities that control darkness, and just to keep the balance.
Well, why do you think that, I guess, early people came up with this explanation for the way of the world?
One thing that often has something to do with it is people interpret their dreams or things like hallucinations, things that they see, to be acts of powerful creatures.
Well, did you like the book?
Yes, this was one of my personal favorites because it just had me on the edge of my seat every time. I couldn't stop reading. I remember one time I stayed up to like 3 or 4 a.m. in the morning just reading this book. Even though this is like a side story or romance, it kind of makes you think what is actually like behind the unexplainable. Because if you see paranormal events in real life or anything like that, you kind of just wonder what's actually happening. Is there somebody watching over me or anything like that?
I like this book. I haven't read a book like this in a while, and so it kind of... I also ended up staying up very late because I forgot that I needed to go to bed, and I was reading this book.
Well, have you guys experienced any paranormal things in your own lives?
One time when I went back to my home country, Laos. So I slept at a temple with my family, and there's a graveyard that's nearby. And I remember waking up in the middle of the night, and I saw like some creatures or something. Not creatures, like some people. And then I blinked or I did something. I turned my head, and I was like, where'd he go?
And did you tell your folks?
Oh, yes, definitely. I was like, I woke them up and everything. I'm like, Dad, you see that?
How did you explain it then? How do you explain it now?
To this day, I still don't have an explanation. I think that it has to involve the graveyard somehow. It wasn't a normal person. I know that for sure.
And it wasn't a dream?
No, it wasn't a dream. Because I woke up my parents, so it's definitely not a dream.
One time I was staying alone with my sister one night, right? And we were in my room. I had already told her to go to sleep. And we started hearing footsteps, like clear footsteps. And it wasn't my parents because I had just called them and they were like 3 hours away. We were so scared. She started crying. She went into my room. She started crying. So I went downstairs and I actually saw a shadow, and it was a person. But when I called my parents, there's someone down here. They said, just check. And I looked, there was nothing there, but I could have sworn I saw like the shadow of a couple people. And They were just gone, and I don't know. Maybe it was someone like through the window, but I don't think so because we clearly heard footsteps and the door opening, but not closing.
So what's your rational explanation now?
We're crazy? I have no idea.
So what makes a page turner? Because that's how you guys all describe this book. What makes a good page turner?
Usually there's a lot of detail, almost as if like you can hear footsteps behind you or there's a shadow behind you or things like that.
A book that is a page turner to me has to be one that has a plot that's not slow but not too fast and has multiple like little different stories happening in the book, and also a book that I would classify as a page turner also usually has some adventure aspect to it.
I always consider page turners as one where the main character is really struggling to something and is in a rush to get out of it.
So urgency and time, it sounds like.
Yeah, definitely. Urgency totally has a play in it.
You guys got some questions for our writer, Christina Farley?
What made you think of writing this book? Like, were there any personal experiences that went into this?
For me, I was teaching at the time. I was teaching in Seoul, Korea, and I wasn't really a writer at that time. Like, I like to write stories, but I didn't think of myself as a professional writer. But I was playing around with it and having fun with it in my classroom, and my students were not really interested in the Greek history. They thought it was a long time ago, and we were doing Greek myths. And I said, hey, we're living in Korea. So I started doing some sample ideas for the kids, and I put them in the stories, and I suddenly had all these little ideas, and from there it kind of morphed into suddenly I had this book, which was Gilded, and it kind of unleashed a whole world for me of this world of Gilded, and also got me writing, which was kind of fun. So really, the Gilded series are based on my actual students. It's based at the school I was teaching at, and even the teachers are in the book, and the principal's in the book. So it was a lot of great memories that's kind of stuck in those pages.
Were there different aspects of your life that kind of made the characters come to life for you?
Yes. A lot of the struggles that I, felt like I was dealing with in life, I put that into the books. And I just feel like as a writer, a part of you is always placed inside those stories, and whether you like it or not. But I feel like to really make a story feel true and to feel real, you need to put yourself in there, which is a little bit scary, because you're kind of exposing a part of yourself and that you have to share to the whole world, but it makes it real, and it makes it, show that the weaknesses of characters is a part of weaknesses of yourself, not everything in there, and then also the strengths as well. So, not everything is exactly me, but there's a part of me in every part of Jaewa, and all the characters really.
Can you relate to the main character?
I'm very driven, and sometimes, I just want to get things done, and Jay was very much like that. Sometimes I'm not as much like this now, but I used to be, where I just kind of headstrong, and just run into a situation without thinking through it because I want to get it done. And that's a fault. I mean, that's something that she deals with and has to suffer the consequences for it later on. But I just felt like I tried to really capture some of the feelings and emotions that I had as a teenager. And, some of the still things I struggle with even now as an adult. But yeah, I definitely identify with Jaewa, and I identify with a lot of characters.
How did you think of such a thorough plot? I mean, it's not every day you get chased by a demigod.
All the 3 books are based on myths, actual myths. So the first one is Hamusu and Princess Yua, and when he sees her, and that's based on an actual Korean myth, and he falls in love with her, and they have a fight, the dad and her. It's all based on that myth. So that's what Gilded kind of started with. And then from there, I interwove different myths along the way. Now, a lot of the things that it's hard to find a lot of, like in Greek mythology, we have so much written down, but a lot of the Korean was lost. So I don't have as much, to work with. But I did intersperse a lot of the types of characters like the Heche and the type of characters that are in those. I brought those in. And then Silvern is based on the legend of these 9 dragons that guard a waterfall in North Korea. And you can actually go visit that waterfall and you can read about the myth there. And the plaque is there that talks about it. So I said, why are these 9 dragons there and what are they guarding, right? So that whole concept inspired Silvern. And then the third one is with the emperor in China and, why talk about his tomb, like why is his tomb surrounded with mercury rivers and how does this all work and how can I bring a story in that? So a lot of these books started with looking at a myth that I was intrigued by and then just kind of spurring from that and then interspersing little myths inside those.
So tell us about your love affair with Korea.
Oh, I love Korea. I mean, there's so much about the country that I just fell in love with. And living there for 8 years, my husband and I moved there with no kids, and we got there, and we thought we're going to stay for 2 years, and we're going to go to another country, because we had lived in Indonesia previous 2 years there, and it was just a fun way to travel. But then we got there, and we're like, we just loved it so much. We stayed for 8 years, and we had 2 kids there. The culture is so beautiful. There's so much, and I try to put as much of that into the books. All my favorite places to visit are in the books, and the favorite train stations and the palaces. And I was really lucky. I got to write many of the scenes at the palace. So when I was doing a whole scene, I was looking around me and writing it. So it was very real for me, and it was just a part of my life. I hope that is reflected in the pages.
We have to ask everybody the most important question, which is, what is your favorite book?
This is a very difficult question, but I would have to say that it wouldn't be a book, it would be an author, and that author would be Catherine Lasky. She writes books kind of with the main characters being animals. She wrote the Wolves of the Beyond series. I relate to animals a lot, and they're really cute.
My favorite book is definitely a book called Winter Girls, which is, I don't know, I guess kind of supernatural. It's about a girl she's anorexic, and she had a best friend who was also anorexic who died in a hotel. And since then, the girl who died became a ghost, and she's been haunting the main character and trying to get her to starve herself and cut herself until the point where she literally almost kills herself. I like a struggle. I like a good struggle.
My favorite book has to be The Juvie 3 by Gordon Corman. It's about 3 boys that were convicted of doing felonies like robbery, and one of them did murder. There was a man who was in charge of a halfway house, and these 3 boys went to go live with this man in a halfway house until something happened to him.
Why do you like this book? You're certainly not going to go out and commit juvenile crimes, I don't think.
It was really action-packed, It's one of those books where you can't predict what is happening next. One time you can fall off a 3-story building, or another time you can slip on a piece of ice and get a concussion. These kind of books, it's hard to come by.
What about you, Julia Cho? What's your favorite book?
My favorite book is The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. I'm just enamored by the story. I think there is something I probably related to, feeling somewhat stuck in a humdrum sort of life, knowing there were so many more possibilities out there. But in the end, realizing how important family and home can be.
Your turn, Christina Farley. What's your favorite book?
I'm obsessed with The Lord of the Rings, anything J.R. Tolkien. I mean, I just love his world building. It is phenomenal. It just blows my mind every time I read his stuff or I go through his files or the languages he's created and the maps and the whole culture that he developed. It's really fascinating. And I really loved, I've done a lot of research on his life. How he studied language, and he used his studies of different types of language to create his own. as the backbone. I thought that was fascinating. There's so much about him that's fascinating. I just really appreciate it as a fantasy writer. And then I have to say, like, I love Jane Austen. I mean, she's a distant relative of mine. My mom is in Austen, and so I'm obsessed with that. The clever, the wit, and she also had great characters. I mean, her characters are just beautiful, and they're just so real. So I loved her for her characters, although my husband says they're boring and that she spends too much time talking about doorknobs. And I'm like, but the doorknobs and the doors are amazing. I want to know all about them. So we have a joke about that. And my boys, I just made them, I keep talking about Pride and Prejudice, so they said we need to watch Pride and Prejudice because we want to know what this is about. There's 2 teenage boys, like one's 12 and one's 14. So literally last weekend, they sat down and like, let's watch it, Mom. And I'm like, I never told them that they had to do it. They sat down and they watched Pride and Prejudice, and they're like, this is a little boring, but they did it because they knew how much I loved it. So yeah.
We'll have a list of everybody's favorite book at our website, bookclubforkids.org. And if you have a favorite book, you could be on the Book Club for Kids podcast, too. Just have your teacher or librarian contact us at kitty@bookclubforkids.org, and we will send out all of the information. This episode is funded in part by the D.C. Commission on the Arts and Humanities, an agency supported in part by the National Endowment for the Arts, and by a grant from the Nora Roberts Foundation. Thanks this week to Jonathan Jensen, who composed and performed our music, and Emma Steinkellner, who designed our logo. And thanks to our writer, Christina Farley, and our celebrity reader, Julia Cho. And thanks to our readers at the Richard Byrd Library in Springfield, Virginia, Peter, Mariana, and Corin. And thanks to the Youth Services Manager at the library, Delia Olberg. We have a free newsletter for teachers, parents, and librarians with tips about how to turn reluctant readers into lifelong book lovers. You sign up at our website, bookclubforkids.org. And that's also where you can find more than 100 other reading tips free of charge. And with election season in full swing, here's a way to get kids engaged in civics education. For the next 2 weeks on the Fina Mendoza Mysteries, tune in to Let Kids Vote. Congressman Mark Takano co-sponsored legislation to lower the voting age to 16. On the show, he takes questions from our fictional characters and answers in his own words about why he doesn't think lowering the voting age to double digits is a particularly good idea. That's the Fina Mendoza Mysteries, wherever you listen to podcasts.